Hello, and welcome back to Dev Game Club, a weekly podcast in which two veteran game developers look at games from the past to discuss their relevance and impact today. I'm Brett Duville, and I'm joined as always by my co-host, a man who never did get the name off of that cabbie's license.
Tim Longo. Yeah, the cabbie I met once, which maybe we'll talk about with our guest at some point. But yeah.
Yeah, speaking of our guest, we are actually three game developers this week. Our guest today started working in the industry in the same place my co-host did, which is to say QA, testing games such as Icewind Dale and Messiah at Interplay. Having been promoted to the design and writing department there on a project that didn't see the light of day, he moved on to Troika Entertainment, writing on Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines, where it was the characters who didn't want to see the light of day. He moved to Obsidian Entertainment, where he creatively led an early version of Alpha Protocol. He provided writing for In Exile's Torment Tides of Numenera, and in the last few years, he founded Double Bear Productions to write and lead Dead State and its updates, and to design and write for Panic at Multiverse High. He was also the narrative lead for the forthcoming Bloodlines 2. Welcome to the cast, Mr. Brian Mitsoda. Hello, Brian.
Hey, guys. What's going on?
It is a fine Sunday in the midwinter here, and we're about the shortest day of the year, which is very appropriate when we're recording this for a vampire-focused chat.
Yes, nice. Yes, yeah. So we, as the audience obviously knows, but Brian may or may not know, we played 5 weeks of Vampire the Masquerade. So yeah, we played through, bit by bit and then talk about it as we go. But we did play it around Halloween time. So, obviously we wanted to get you on the podcast. So this will obviously come out after that series is over, but it doesn't obviously matter because it's the most important thing is just to kind of talk to you and hear about your journey and hear about your specifically your experience with Vampire. One of the ways that we like to start, though, especially because of a lot of the listeners and fans kind of ask these sorts of questions and want us to ask these questions, is really the basics of like how you got. I mean, Brett in the intro talked about you kind of starting in QA, which I did as well, and so major props for that. I have a lot of respect for all of us who have that beginning. But so how did you get into the industry, and how did you sort of transition into designing and writing, in your early career? Maybe give us kind of an intro in your own words.
Sure. So I originally I was living in Los Angeles, and I went out there because I thought, I want to do screenwriting. I was obviously a huge gamer back in those days as well, and so I was playing Fallout 1, and I was so impressed with it. Like, I hadn't played anything that kind of felt where the choices felt like they mattered, and I played through it several times and several different characters and tried to see all the different outcomes, and I was just really amazed by it. And I thought, well, this is like the kind of writing I think I want to be doing. So I found out, where Fallout was made, which was Orange County, which not too far from Los Angeles, and I applied for a QA position in Interplay, which was the parent company of Black Isle. And I got the job. I went in there. I just remember interviewing, and I was dressed in a suit to go interview for QA. And
in California,
you're not alone, sir. You're not alone. That is a common thing.
That might be at least two of us, I'd say, because I also wore a suit to my interview.
Yeah, good for you.
Yeah, so there were a lot of strange looks when I was walking through the QA pit. And I remember, I think it was a very short interview, and I think I just kind of got the job at the end of it because it was, obviously, I think for QA they just screen out RU base level. Back then, I think now it's a little bit more. It's a little bit more difficult to get into QA nowadays because there are higher standards. But back in those days, we're like, are you a lunatic? Do you smell all right? do you seem to know how to use a computer? That kind of thing.
Yeah, it's definitely evolved these days. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, for Tim, then 2 out of 3 ain't bad. I'm not going to say which one.
Okay. Very nice. Very nice.
Yeah. So I got into QA, and I immediately, I moved down to Orange County, and I immediately kind of got to work on several different games. I know that like the first day I worked was on a game that I don't think anyone remembers. I think it was called Invictus.
I remember.
Oh, do you remember that one?
I don't think I played it, but I do remember it. I mean, I saw it in your notes. I was like, oh, I remember that game. Yeah. I was very dialed into what all the games were coming out back then. Like, I just remember every title I ever see. I even remember Torn when I saw that. I was like, oh, I remember that getting out.
Oh, you're one of the few. It's so it basically was like at that time, there was like your normal day work, and then at night there were usually like, if you wanted to, you could get overtime by work because they were trying to get some games out the door. And so you could work overtime doing QA on some of the other titles they were trying to get out. And like at that time, the title they were trying to get out was Planescape Torment.
Oh, nice.
So I got to do QA on Planescape Torment in the very late process. So because I was new to the Planescape Torment project or QA development, I essentially was like the QA tester. One of the QA testers was like, okay, play through the game and tell us like just like your impressions. So that was cool.
You're a blind tester for them, basically.
Yeah. So that was fun, and I got to play Planescape Torment, which of course at that time everybody was kind of like, okay, this is going to be a big deal. And then I got to work on Messiah, which was another game that was, let's say, not ready to go out the door. And we kind of moved the QA team that was on it into Shiny. And so we worked at Shiny really for months, QAing Messiah. And I think I was the one that could get through it the fastest. So I think it was like every like gold candidate, I'd like have to play through it and get through it as quickly as possible. So, the other, then when I went back, to Interplay, I worked, on Icewind Dale, and I was the in-house tester. So I moved into the Black Isle offices. And I worked, right with the devs. So after working on Icewind Dale and working at Black Isle, actually, I was the sign-off person for that one too. I think I remember it being very late at night trying to get through the gold candidate and going, does it crash? Does it work? And then the producer basically going, okay, did you finish it? Okay, great. Then that's it. That's the one. So it was that one. I just remember I think it was like very early in the morning when I got out of there. And don't crunch, kids.
Yeah, seriously.
So I just remember getting out like really early in the morning. The sun was out, so I remember that. Then after working in Icewind Dale and getting to know all the devs at Black Isle, I got brought onto this new project. They heard I had an interest in writing and a background with writing, so they brought me on as a junior designer writer on Torn, which worked on that for about a year before it got canceled. But obviously, no one has a frame of reference for Torn. It was never released, but it was essentially trying to be like use the special system from Fallout, but in like a fantasy universe.
Right.
And yeah, I mean, it was a good experience being on Torn, and I got to learn a lot, and I worked with some really cool people. But obviously it was a little crushing to have the first game that you work on. And you're like, oh man, I'm so excited. You know how juniors are. We're really excited when we're juniors, and we think this is the coolest thing ever. And we're starry-eyed, and we haven't been beaten down yet. So it was just a veteran dev was like, there is a chance your game's going to get canceled. But juniors are just like, oh, it's going to be so great, and it's going to go out there and be the best thing ever, and
everyone's going to love it, and
and then it gets canceled, and you're like, you're just you're on your path to becoming a veteran.
Right away.
It's just that's the break. So that from there, actually I took like a year off because I was so. I do this like every time. I think every time something horrible happens to the game industry, I'm like, well, I'm getting out of the game industry. I'm done with that. But I went off to Japan for a year, and then came back, and by the end of that year, I was like, I really want to get back into games. And so I just happened to get an interview with Troika for what would become Bloodlines. And again, I think I got an interview and I got the job in like the same day. So from there, it was a lot of work on Bloodlines, a lot of pretty much the next year and a half of my life, basically just in the Troika offices.
Right. It's interesting because we you may or may not know this, but we've been doing the podcast for quite a while now. It's going to be almost 5 years, and we've played Fallout 1, we've played Torment, and we had Tim and Leonard on to talk about that, and so and I think partially because of our taste, Brett and my taste, like we have played a lot of games and we talk about sort of like that area of California and the kinds of games that have come out and are still coming out of that area. There's a sort of like a group of developers, a style, right? Like, and Interplay was really at the core of that. So you kind of got in with, in that same sort of era and got to work on some of those classic games and learn sort of, it sounds like, kind of from the same sort of folks that were, the genesis of things like Fallout, because Fallout and Torment specifically are still so influential on so many things, of course. And so that's cool to hear that was some of your upbringing as well. So
yeah, there's definitely a methodology that you learn working on those kind of games. It challenges you to think about branching and how to the flow of conversation in a game where you can pick how the player navigates through the conversation. There's a lot of things that you learn from those kind of games that you don't learn from writing strictly linear games. And I actually prefer the challenge of writing branching dialogue to linear games. I don't even know if I've ever worked on a linear game.
Yeah, right. Well, and that's awesome that you brought that topic up, because that's, obviously we were hopeful to have you on, and I think one of the main reasons, though there's many, is to talk about that, that structure, and how it is different. And Brett and I have not, though we've made many games, we have not made a game like that, and so we're very, there's a lot of questions that when we played Vampire, it's sort of like how difficult that is and how you approach it. So you're okay. So you got the Vampire job. You're now at Troika, which as a fan of Fallout and of Tim and Leonard back in the day, Brett and I were both at LucasArts at the time, but I was definitely a fan, especially of Tim's work. And so Troika as a company was something that I just loved and was excited to play everything that they did. And I did end up missing Vampire at the time, but so now you're at Troika, which I would assume would be pretty cool and exciting. You're now working with some of the folks that worked on, at least on Fallout and such. How did the Vampire process start for you? Like, what was were you there? How early in the project were you hired on? Was it right away, or had they been going?
So they had been working on Vampire for about a year, I believe, or maybe a little bit over that. They had mostly been doing a lot of work on the tech, the level design, some of the tools that were being used. There were some very early story stuff. There was some early character art. There was just a lot of pieces. But when I came on, I was pretty much actually a lot of people came on at that point. It was like several different developers kind of came on around the same time that I did, and we were given a lot of freedom to make the game, cohesive and work. And basically, I was allowed to pretty much throw out in anything that was there and start over with the story stuff, as long as like some basic story, high level story beats were kept in. It was great because we had some things like there was some hub work already done as far as like spaces that you could walk around in, but there was like no content.
No content, right.
Yeah. And so it was pretty much, it was, I mean, from a, I guess, younger designer standpoint, it was like, wow, I can dream whatever I want, really.
Yeah. That's cool.
This license is mature, and I can tell, I can make characters or dialogue that is, is natural for this setting. This is fantastic. Like I can say fuck. It's great. It's and so it's one of those things where it really is like a 1 in a million kind of shot. A lot of the developers were younger devs, and they're kind of all, really hungry to make like their, this game was like this. They saw something in the game immediately where everyone was like, "Oh, this is gonna be good, and this is gonna be fun to work on." And it was fun, and we did. The owners all gave us a lot of freedom to do what we wanted, and they there was no shortage of things to do. It was kind of like an indie project in that, if you wanted to work on something, you could. And because we didn't have a whole lot of people on the team, it was a pretty small team. And so it was kind of, okay, well, you want to design that level? Okay, cool. You can design that level. You want to write this character? Cool. You can write this character. You want to work on, this support system? Go for it.
Wow.
And yeah, and of course from a learning process perspective, like that's great. You get your hands on a lot of different things, and you learn kind of best practices pretty quickly. Whereas nowadays, you find that most designers are going to be very specialized, and even from a writing standpoint, it's people were. I don't think people were being really called narrative designers at that point, but because you are a designer and a writer on the project, you got to control a lot more of how the world fit together from the narrative standpoint, which I think at that time it felt like a lot of games were the writing just kind of came in later. A lot of times it would be like a screenwriter or a writer that didn't really have any input into the design at all.
Right. Yeah.
That still happens.
I was going to say, not even felt like. I mean, was and still.
What's
the case? Is, right? The writer will do something, as our friend Matthew Burns wrote.
Oh yeah, that's great. I think anybody who wants to get in the game industry should play that.
Yep. Yeah, absolutely.
That is like the most realistic simulation of working in games.
Yeah. Oh, also Tom Bissell, I should note.
Yeah, and Tom Bissell. Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, so to your point of sort of like how fun and awesome and exciting it was to be able to work on what you wanted to work on. How did that break down for you? Were you doing level design as well as writing, or and you mentioned some hub stuff was kind of already there when you came on, but what was the breakdown of work for you specifically? Sorry, Brett, I don't know if I talked.
No, that's fine. Go ahead.
So because there were only 2 full-time designers on the project,
wow.
I gravitated more towards well, there was no shortage of things. So it's like for hubs, it's like you're filling out the world with quests and characters, and then of course then doing the writing for those quests and the design for those quests, and kind of bringing the hubs to life, kind of figuring out like what the feel or the mood of that hub is, and making sure that like that's kind of supported with the characters that are there. And then I was doing level design, and for example, like the Ocean House Hotel was
nice. That was a great level.
Yeah, that was the level that there was an Ocean House kind of level built, but there was nothing in it, and so I worked to get it scary. So I defined a bunch of, so basically for the Ocean House, what I did was I was looking at like, I wanted to make it a really scary experience. So I started looking at, old ghost films, and I started looking at like the process that they used on like the rides at like Universal, where anything is kind of, a controlled, experience, that's trying to get a certain thrill out of someone. So I defined a bunch of like scare props and scare ideas. And what I did was, like, you'll notice like with the Ocean House is that it feels like it's non-linear at first, because you can kind of walk around the first room that you're in. And there are some events that are kind of, that if you go into a certain place, something will play. But as soon as you go up the staircase, which you have to at some point, then you'll fall into a linear corridor. And then essentially we use a lot of sound to draw players to locations, and then of course, occasionally trap them in a room, and then a thing happens, and then it's all drawn. It's always drawing the player into the place you want them to be, and then doing the scare, and then like letting them go on. And a lot of times it's funneling you in a direction, even though it might not feel that way because of the way that it's designed.
Right.
But the Ocean House was a really great one, and I kind of had to fight hard for that one because, as you might be aware, like, things aren't really scary until like the final sound is in. Right. Otherwise it just kind of feels like, well, this is mildly scary or even annoying. But one of those things that, like, that's one of those ones where I think, early on I really had to defend the design of that one, because people were like, well, there's no combat in it. Can we put some combat in it to make it, to make it more exciting? And I stuck to my guns on that one. And when we did get the final the sound in, luckily it was like, everyone's like, oh, now I understand. It is scary now.
Yeah.
It's just one of those things where, and of course, you have to, it's kind of a gamble, because like I'm pretty sure it's going to be really scary when the sound goes in. And had it not been, I would have been probably in trouble. So, but it did work out, and I know that like that ended up being like one of the fan favorite levels.
Yeah, it's awesome to hear that you stuck to your guns, especially on the combat point, because I could totally see in the series we definitely talk about sort of the ratio of combat and sort of what kind of genre of a game it is, because it's such a hybrid of many things. Mm-hmm. But I think that if that level had combat, it definitely would not have been as good, because I remember being surprised by the nature of that level when we played it, because it didn't, and it was just an ambient experience with this sort of like very world building and visual storytelling and audio storytelling and, set piece, but it wasn't like, and it did become linear at some point. So it wasn't even that you had like, multiple paths or anything. It still was just like you said, the amusement park kind of theme park ride, And so I think, that's a great little tidbit there, because I think combat would have really not necessarily ruined it, but it just wouldn't have been this, because there were other one-off levels that had combat in them in the game, and they were definitely felt way different. Yeah, so that's great. So I think on the ratio, so it's interesting. So 2 designers, that's crazy. Especially if both of you were doing level design and writing. So what, from a hub perspective, which we spent a lot of time talking about as well, because I think that's definitely one of the cooler, unique aspects of, at least for me being an level designer myself as well, like structurally with the game. How, were there specific hubs that you were in charge of, or was it more collaborative?
It was more collaborative on the hubs, because there's just so much content to do in a hub. The tricky thing about hubs in open world shows this as well, is that there needs to be a certain density of content in a hub, or it feels empty and it feels like there's nothing going on. And it kind of works. It works to our advantage in Vampire Bloodlines, because it was something where we could go, well, it is very late at night and there's not going to be a lot of people out.
Right.
And, there's not going to be a whole lot of life out on the streets or cars or anything. The cool thing about the hubs for like Bloodlines was that, we're trying to get the feel of a real area. So we're using little bits and pieces, and kind of like taking the whole of Santa Monica and like shrinking it down to like just a block or 2 blocks, and giving it like but in the same time making it kind of its own version of Santa Monica. And it's not really Santa Monica, but people who go, like play the game then go to Santa Monica Pier and they're like, oh, it's just like in the game. It's not really.
Yeah.
But it is like, it's also like, what is the feel of like, who lives here? Who's out at this time? Trying to, like, we had some locations already built. Like we had, so I think we had like, I want to say the clinic was there, but we redid some of it just for like challenge sake, and for quests that were going through there. But like, a clinic at night is great because, it's who's coming in at like 2 a.m.
The emergency room kind of aesthetic, right? Of like the crazy stuff that happens at midnight. Yeah. And it was successful. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, then you have like, you have the beach. So we're like, who's hanging out at the beach at this time? And, you just kind of think of like all the spaces that you have and like who lives here. Why do I want to go in there? Like, what, as a player, why am I drawn to this place? And like, how do I make it like obvious, like who I'm supposed to talk to? And what are my expectations going into a clinic? Obviously, as a player, I'm like, I'm going to steal drugs. That's what I'm going to do.
Right.
I'm going to go like see what I can get into. There's, it's a vampire game. So we have to have someone selling blood. So we have, that's the kind of part of the clinic that touches the world of darkness, because the guy who's selling blood obviously deals with vampires, or maybe works for a vampire. So, you think all those things through and you think through your spaces, and you have the player expectation of who they're going to meet there. And you try to satisfy what the player is going to want to do when they see that location.
Mm-hmm. The fantasy fulfillment of it in this context. Yeah, for sure. Yeah, and I think, I mean, we definitely we'll want to come back to sort of the Vampire the Masquerade side of the game in a bit, because I think that, I mean, one of, I think the reasons it's a cult classic is because it achieved, for its time, and I think even so, still today, a lot of it holds up. It achieved a pretty unique flavor of an RPG that you just don't see very often, you know, and especially from that world. So yeah, that's awesome that was clearly a goal you guys had and were going after. I mean, I'm pretty impressed, like you said, with the sort of freeform aspect of getting to kind of work on what you wanted to work on and kind of like bounce around a lot. I'm actually pretty impressed then of how cohesive the game feels. You know, because if you were kind of, if it was more sort of mercenary on just kind of, again, bouncing around, did you guys have a process of sort of coordinating with each other to kind of make sure that quests overlapped or like things made sense, or like or was it just iteration and play testing? And, you know, how did you ensure that it felt like a cohesive world when it was so free form?
So we would have meetings to just discuss like the hubs and like we would have a meeting, kind of break down like what are some brainstorming of what can go on in the hub or in these spaces.
Right.
And then we would also try to, you know, divide up like some of the quests and after we'd all discuss them as a group. We would then kind of go off and kind of make further iterations on it with like a scripter or level designer, or level artist, I should say. We did a lot of it by the seat of our pants because we had no time. Yeah. So a lot of it was decent planning and a lot of luck. I still don't know how we got the amount of content we got in a year and a half. I do know it was a lot of late nights. So it was just kind of one of those things where, like, if, you know, you couldn't just wait around for something to be fixed or someone to do something. It was kind of like, well, I see a gap here. I see something that's not lining up with some of the rest of the design, so I might as well just go in and fix it
yourself.
Just fix it yourself.
Yeah, I'm very appreciative of that. I mean, that's often, I don't know how to say this delicately, but like that's something I think we've lost a lot. I'll just say in the decades since, just because things have gotten so much more specialized. You know, I've worked with people who will say, well, I'm waiting on such and such, and I'll say, well, but for how long? And they'll say, well, it's been like 2 weeks. I'm like, what? Just do it. Like, what are you waiting for? Like, you're editing some text file somewhere or what, you know, you use this tool for 3 seconds to change a number. Like, just do it. Like, what are you waiting for? You know, if we have to have a meeting to find out why 2 weeks have gone by, that's the time wasted. And that's a difference between now and then, I think, that has happened.
It is. Like, there is a lot, like I said earlier, and you said, there is a lot of specialization now, and of like everyone is very protective of what kind of, in some projects, some people are very protective of like what is their domain. And so you can't really, obviously, you know, on an indie game, you have that mentality because it's like no one else is going to fix it. You best just do it yourself. And I actually, I mean, just, I guess like Bloodlines felt more like that. It did feel like it was an indie developer situation. And in many ways it was. Troika was a very small company and everyone was kind of young. There wasn't really a process established yet on how to go about making this game or making these types of games. A lot of it was just good instincts from people. And it is one of those things where, you know, I had a lot of, doing indie development was in some ways really freeing for me. So doing Dead State, for example, felt a lot more like working on Bloodlines, and that I didn't have to, you know, get permission to do anything. I just did it. And it was frustrating for the like from a financial standpoint of having to fund and make your own game. That's terrifying, but it was. I do enjoy having a lot more freedom to go and fix or create things without having to go through a process. But it all depends on the project and how it's set up. It's collaboration is great too, and working with a lot of other people is also one of those things where, oh, you know what, I didn't think about that. That's great. I'm gonna put that in.
Yeah. Balance of those things, I think, can really be beneficial. Yeah, mm-hmm. But I think, especially the bigger projects, which we've all worked on in some facet, can swing too far into, to Brett's point, too far in the other direction, right? Where it's like you said, everyone stays in their lane and doesn't want to leave the lane, and then lots of stuff can trickle down from that problem. But
the other nice thing with there just being a couple of designers is that you both could probably more or less keep the whole game in your head. Mm-hmm. Right? I mean, there wasn't like you had a pretty good idea of where everything was, like if you did need to make changes, which is also kind of unusual, especially for a game of that scope. Like, when you said that, I was like, oh my God, I should ask too. Like, who was the other designer?
It was TJ Perillo, and I will say that Chad Moore also, he was he was a character artist, but he also did design and writing on it as well. There are some things that Jason took on, Jason Anderson, one of the owners, took on. He would, he did some of the levels as well. Leonard was definitely in a lot of the meetings where we were discussing content. So it was kind of like, well, what's anyone's schedule like and what can they take on? And really one of the things is because we were such a small team, everybody can kind of talk about everything together. So that's another reason, like everyone kind of was on the same page and had an idea of like what was in the game. But it does, when you do have fewer designers, then everybody can kind of remember where everything goes, what everything's about. And, for characters even, it's like, well, what characters have what relationships with other characters and what is that relationship? And how do we make sure we hint at that or be very explicit about that with those characters so that when somebody's character is referencing another character, there's a lived-in quality where someone understands like the relationship there, even if the people writing those characters are different.
Yeah, that really came through. I mean, it was really, and it makes a lot of sense as you're describing sort of the team size and structure that would have been able to be, that would be possible, because it definitely felt that way. It felt like, which I definitely want to segue to sort of a very related topic to that, as you brought up earlier, of just sort of like the lessons learned and sort of like you said, you've never worked on a linear narrative game. Like what I know it's probably, we would never have time in a short podcast to go over all of this topic, but like, what's your short version of like some of those great lessons you've been learning, basically building branching games, branching storylines and stuff, and keeping, like you were just saying, all those tendrils sort of together and making sense, but then occasionally crossing, because that's one of the things I loved about Vampire, is that some of those branches would cross over in sometimes subtle ways, sometimes obvious ways. And it did, like, the sense of place and the sense of a world, even though these hubs were not that big, I think really came through. And it was a 3D representation of a lot of like Tim and Leonard and Jason's games, so I feel like, So what were some of you mentioned sort of trial by fire on branching systems. What was that like for you? What did you learn from that stuff?
So the shorthand for branching is like there's a tendency for people who haven't done it before to just to go and make everything its own separate branch. Like anything the player can do, it opens up like a new branch.
Right.
That's madness. Essentially, what you're doing is a lot of careful planning as to when things have different conclusions and or different ways to navigate through the dialogue that may be referenced, or the character at the start of the dialogue, it starts out the same way, and then like if you do this with the character, then the way they leave off at the end of the conversation is to be kind of pissed at you, or to be very flirty with you or something. And so you're feeling out. You essentially write out like, what are the things I can do in this dialogue? What are the priorities for this character? What are the things that I need to do? Like, are they involved with the quest? Then they need to do this. They need to impart some kind of crucial information that everybody needs to get. But after that, it's like, well, can I do anything to get more money, or to try to flirt with this character? Or can I do anything to piss off the character? Can I do anything that might lead to a different objective to the quest? Like you plot all that out ahead of time. And then when you're writing the character, you kind of have an outline of like where you're branching and what you're doing. One thing that is very helpful in branching conversation is to kind of have places where it can branch out, and then it goes into a central location again, especially with like anything that's like the player must learn this. Right. It'll go wide and then it'll come back, and it will then kind of usually then from that point where the player has learned the crucial information or gotten the quest, like you go out from there, and then, it might end one of several ways, or it'll just end on the same way, depending on the character. But a lot of it also is like when you get into the writing stage, you kind of feel it out. You're like, oh, it'd be kind of interesting when the character says this, if like I had this kind of follow-up. And so a lot of that is kind of organic in that when you're writing it, you feel it out in another way. And then for quest design, obviously, with quest design, you can't have a million different outcomes, but you can have several stated outcomes that you're going to do for this quest, and you make sure that those are accounted for in the dialogue, or the way that maybe if there are characters that are playing off of one another, then you account for all the things you've done so far, or you make sure that you've got your outcomes represented in a way that feels good. Like the important thing for like branching or branching quests or anything is that like you anticipate what the player might want to do, what you think the player would want to do, and right. Then you then produce results that will reflect what you think the player will want to do. And then sometimes even when you're playing the quest or someone's playing the quest, they'll be like, hey, it'd be cool if you could do this. And like, yep, that is cool. And that won't take that long. So we'll add that outcome as well. So it is a structural challenge, but it's also an organic process where you're feeling it out as you go.
Yeah. I love that you're focused so much on player intent and wish fulfillment, as a goal, and kind of constantly asking yourself that versus, for instance, designer intent, you know what I mean? And like what we want to do or what we think is the right thing, but thinking through, especially with a property, when you're working with an IP. Go ahead, Brett.
Yeah, well, especially with like a tabletop thing where, of course, that's what it's all about. One of the things I've been hearing a lot throughout the whole conversation is sort of the narrative design aspects of what you've done and the writing aspects of what you've done, which have become separate specializations in today's day and age. I love hearing right there about how they bleed together. Because when you're doing the writing, you're like, oh, it'd be nice if on the narrative design side, I had this opportunity to bring something back in. But for our audience, who maybe doesn't have an idea of the distinction between those two things, narrative design and writing, could you maybe talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I'd love to. I don't think there's a really very good understanding of it in the industry even.
No, I agree.
Narrative design.
Agree.
So yes, maybe also for some of the developers in our audience.
For everybody in the audience, developer or fan alike. So writing is the easy one to explain. Writing is generally, if it's a writing job, the writer is just brought in. They've already a lot of times they've already designed the game. And then they are they've got these sections where, well, at this point, this guy says a thing to this guy, and there's a cutscene, and in the cutscene you learn this, and the writer basically comes in and fills in the blanks, and a lot of times writers are brought in to do cutscenes, make the temp dialogue better, and the thing that a lot of writers end up doing a lot of is barks. Which if
24 ways to say ow.
Yes. Okay, well, we need 6 variants to say I'm throwing a grenade. 7 variants of ow. I'm getting hit with this kind of weapon. I'm getting hit with I'm on fire now. So
I'm on fire now. That's a great line. I love it.
Hey everyone, just so you know, I'm on fire. Thanks. So there's that. That's what a lot of writers. Sometimes you'll even see a lot of times writers are brought in late in the process. So sometimes with writers, they'll get to work on a lot of games in a short time period because they're usually being brought in towards the end to fill in the blanks and finish the writing segment of the game.
Right.
So now narrative design. Narrative design is a process that you're not just writing the game. You're having input on like who is in the game, who are the characters in the game. You're working on the story. You're working on the look and feel of things. Like what is as I talked about with like the hubs, for example, you're defining like what is the experience of this hub? How do the quests reflect that? A lot of times you are also, as a narrative designer, building or helping to build the tools. On every game that I have worked on, I have worked on like a dialogue editor. Making a dialogue editor for the game, because almost every game has different requirements and your editor needs to be able to do a number of things to make the dialogue work or to make quests work. You're working on you might be working on any number of tools that support narrative or writing elements or quest elements in the game. You're having a big input on like making sure certain themes are propping up in the game. You might have input on the cutscenes and how to even where they're needed. You will have you might have some input on the level design. Certainly today, it's not as much that I get to do level design, but you're in the room and you're throwing out ideas and you're making sure that it kind of stays consistent with what the player can do or what their experience is going to be in the game, and you're making sure it's cohesive. A big part of narrative design is cohesion, making sure from place to place that the goals of narrative are being represented.
Right.
What else do we do?
It's a list, huh? It's a good long list of all interconnected stuff. Yeah, it's awesome.
Yeah. So also, just how are you going to deliver the writing? Like in these days, when you think of some big like Ubisoft game or something like that, there's multiple avenues for writing to be delivered. But figuring out what those avenues are, right, is a separate discipline as well. Often, usually that's a narrative designer's job. Every artifact is going to have this kind of text or this string of text if you get a collection of them or whatever. Yeah.
Yeah, I would say so. I'd say for narrative design, if you're doing narrative design, you're actually not doing a whole lot of writing. Like your day to day is like, I'd say it's like kind of a breakdown of about 30% writing and 70% it's technical or design. It's not a lot of it. There are probably in the industry it might seem like, oh well, you go do some writing, but like it's quite a lot of design. You really do have to know design inside and out, because even like branching requires a good deal of understanding of design and player psychology. And so that's kind of just doing branching dialogue, for example, requires the layout of the quest and the layout of your different paths. And so that is in itself a design challenge.
Right. Yeah. It's its own flow, just like level design has flow, narrative design has flow too. Yeah. I think that's well put. And I think it's good. I'm trying to think, we've had a few writers and narrative folks on, but not as many as we'd like. And so it's great to have somebody kind of go deep into that, the differentiation there, because it is so unique. And Vampire, I think, is a good example of an era where, as you already said, Brian, and and I think we've said on the podcast before, that wasn't a role per se, right? It's become much more of a role now, but it was happening. It just, we didn't know it was happening. Right. It was like, and so it's sort of something that's evolved over time, especially as teams have gotten bigger and stuff, and games have gotten more complex. But I think Vampire is a really great nucleus of a version of that back in that era. I think I would like to switch, just for time's sake, I would like to switch to a topic we definitely need to hit. And it really is talking about the IP and working with Vampire. Mm-hmm. And for me, it's sorry to switch topics so abruptly, but for me, there's twofold questions. One is how did you guys approach working with Vampire? Because I think my personal opinion, and we talked about this on the series, one of the reasons I think it's still a good cult classic is that you guys really achieved fulfilling that wish fulfillment of playing a vampire game. Because
you might say they embraced it, Tim.
They embraced it. Okay, well done. Okay, because there's just so many, we talked about on the series. There's just so many sci-fi and fantasy RPGs out there, and they're just nothing like this, right? And so you have this great property. So how difficult was it to work with Vampire? And you mentioned being able to use, curse words and stuff. It's like, it's also an adult game. And then the other side of that's very related is working with multiple clan perspectives, because each of the vampire clans were represented. You could play as each of them. And then each of them I played Nosferatu. And so like the game is completely different, it feels like, as a Nosferatu. And so doing for each of those groups, having its own sort of threads sounds maddening to me. So like, how was it working with, I know that's a lot of questions, but anyway, generally anything you want to talk about in that category would be great.
Okay. Well, I actually had not played any of or really read any of the tabletop before I started the project. So the first thing I did when I got on the project was read every single book.
Yeah, sure.
And get an understanding of the world. The IP holder at the time was pretty generous with letting us do whatever we wanted in that space, as long as we didn't kind of color too far outside the lines. I think the IP was the most important thing, was kind of representing what it's about. And at the time, it was the kind of mature and gritty and kind of sexy alternative to like D&D. Right. And it is one of those things where with an IP, there is an expectation from the players that they're going to want the representation of the thing that they know the IP about. But at the same time, like if you get with an IP, if you go too close, or if you try to adhere too close to the IP, or you are trying to stick to the rules too much, then you might have a drier experience. And in some IPs, you're not going to be allowed to go very far outside the boundaries of the IP. But like, if for example, in like, if you throw around too much lore terms in an IP, it's like the people who know that IP will be like, oh yeah, I know what that is. That's great. But people who don't know, like, this is just garbage. This is nonsense. I don't know what they're talking about. And so you really have to be very careful how you approach even just like that kind of those terms that would only be known by someone who is familiar with that IP, and you kind of like gradually bring someone into that world. Like you can't just there are some games where like the characters start talking, and you immediately like I really don't understand anything you're saying. They have referenced like several events that I don't know about and several factions that I have no idea what they're talking about.
Yeah. I worked on Halo for many years, so I definitely know what you're talking about. Yeah, totally. That's well put. I think it's totally, but I mean, all that being said, I feel like, and I think Brett, I did play Vampire as a tabletop player, and so I knew the world somewhat, and World of Darkness, but Brett's a good maybe litmus test for that because he didn't know any of that. But I feel like, Brett, correct me if I'm wrong, but when we talked about it on the series, like you felt pretty introduced to the world and the groups, and I feel like they threaded that needle quite well.
Yeah, absolutely. I only had really the card game to base my knowledge on. I had never played the tabletop at all, and it's been however many years, a long time, let's just say, since I played the card game. So coming to it again, it was just like, oh yeah, I don't, there was a TV show. Like I have only the vaguest stuff. One of the things I think that really worked for that was introducing you as a newly embraced vampire, right?
Yeah.
So the player is just the character rather that the player inhabits is at the same time learning this stuff, and so that's kind of a natural fit as well.
Yeah.
One thing I do like about the IP as well is like so in like most RPGs, the character is like is a hero, or the character is very important in the world.
Yeah.
Right.
And what I love about IP is like the baby vampires are they have no power. They have no power at all, and no one cares about them, and everyone is going to use them. And that just was one big part of the appeal of the IP, in that it didn't come with the like chosen one kind of storyline attached to it.
Yeah, great point. Yeah, totally. And it not only that, but it also allows you, what you did in the game, it allows you to have that character progress and become more infamous over the course of it. At least for the Nosferatu, like there was this sense, I assume it's with everybody, but there's this sense of like you're making a name for yourself, and you're gaining trust and allies and enemies, and so that progression is more important than coming right in as like you said, as the chosen one. The chosen one stories just get so old sometimes, especially in RPGs. It's just so common. That's a great point. Yeah. So what about the diversity of all the different groups, the vampire groups, and having to you didn't have very many designers and writers or what have you, but did each of you like have certain clans that you were in charge of, or did you touch all of them? Or it just seems so crazy because there's so many of them, and each of them. And one of the things the game is known for is that each playthrough. And I loved in your intro when you talked about playing Fallout as a player for the first time and being blown away about all the different repercussions of your options. But in Vampire, it goes even further. Every character you play, every vampire you play is a different playthrough, and people seem to have loved that. So how hard was that to do?
It is again like a narrative design, plotting it all out kind of issue where you're like, well, if someone chooses this clan, you want to make sure that at some points in the game that is represented. So who are the characters in the game, and like who is a member of that clan? So who's more likely to notice, and who's going to notice for the opposite reason where they don't like you? And making sure that you have a good number of options in there, so you feel like it makes a difference. A lot of it is illusion. It feels like it's happening a lot more often than it is. For something like the Nosferatu, it's kind of like modding the game for the Nosferatu. It's like, well, who is going? Like, obviously, the Nosferatu, like, they can't go through. They're going through the sewers a lot. They can't go on the street. Like, you basically have to then kind of make the work into like a compatibility for the NOS playthrough. And so you've got to figure out, well, how does the NOS get in here? Because this is a public place. Or if they do talk to someone, like, what is the outcome? So, like, obviously with certain people, like when the Nosferatu character goes to talk to, like, a blood doll, for example, all their options are they're not going to be able to seduce them. That's definitely going to be built in. There's one option, like, for example, like where the Nosferatu can kill someone from their appearance. It's like the waitress at the cafe.
Totally. I had told that story on air, and it blew Brett away because he's like, "Wait, what happened?" And that was my solution. Yeah, it felt like you just said it there too. I want to pull on that thread, but playing the Nosferatu felt almost like a mod is a good way to put it too. But it almost felt like at times like I was playing an exploited version of the game because I was always doing like the weird approach to something. But then to your point about the smoke and mirrors, obviously the Nosferatu in the main story plays a big role on the critical path. So as a Nosferatu, when I got to some of those moments, like going down, under the city and meeting all the Nosferatu down there, I felt more important because I was already a Nosferatu, so it was cool to kind of like, and obviously that was somewhat planned, but for my playthrough, it felt it was an unplanned sort of delight, if you will, for that. So that's a cool point too.
Yeah, so the Nosferatu, of course, needed some reworking for certain dialogues, especially for humans, because they were going to react to them in some way. But of course, with vampires, obviously, you're just a Nosferatu. So I didn't have to do a complete mod to the vampire dialogues. But like the Malkavians...
which is the other character. That was what I played.
So the Malkavians not only have certain events that only happen for them, like, for example, if you can have a conversation with the TV newscaster, which you probably figured out is played by me.
I also wanted to say it's nice to have another Romero on the cast as well. The Malkavians were much more challenging because you essentially have to reskin all of the dialogue. And not only are you reskinning every player line, but for the Malkavians, you're also you have different dialogues with different people that feel completely different than and of course some vampires really don't care for Malkavians, and then you have some humans that you meet that are completely different experience with the Malkavian player. And that was a lot of fun, but it was a lot of work. And that was again like another mod for the game, right? It was like completely redoing it from the Malkavian perspective. And it was a lot of work. It was a lot of work to redo or to do the Malkavian versions of every single dialogue.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah. We're about at time, and we could definitely, I probably have 100 more questions, but we'll close down. But two that we, one more selfish one, and then one that we usually try to end with for the guests that we do have on.
Okay.
Part of the point of the podcast is for us to talk about these older games as developers, and then kind of talk about their influence on games today and like what legacy they've had and what they've brought forward to actually impact the world. And you kind of talked about Fallout as an example of something that had an influence on you. But for you as a developer, having worked on this game, is there something from Vampire that you've brought forward with you that's kind of like a lesson learned and you've obviously talked about a lot of those over the course of the hour, but is there something that you kind of come back to time and time again as a nugget that you brought from working on this game?
Yeah, and I've probably said this before in other interviews and to other devs, but I think one of the things that I learned was from Vampires is character writing. And the approach that I took in Vampire, and one that I think that I've carried on for everything else is that, like, when you conceive of a character, there's the important thing to think about is like think about this character's been here for how long. They know these people. They know how to do these things. This is what they do to people they don't know. Like you have a sense of who that character is in the world and what their purpose is. And there's a player facing purpose that they exist for, but they also have their own life and they exist. And it's important in the writing to reflect that, to make them feel realistic. It's that they don't feel like they exist just for the player, that player is interrupting their life, and that they are not, from a realism perspective, what is there when someone comes up to them? Are they suspicious? Are they curious? Are they angry? Are they, bored? It's one of those things where, you have to know who that character is, and to really sell that they've got other shit going on. They're not there for your amusement. They have their own life going on. They have their own world that they're part of. So it's really important for like character writing that you come in with this sense of purpose of this character, and that the idea that they are not there strictly for to exist for the player at that moment. They are there in the world, and they're operating in the same way the player is. They've got their own things to do. So I mean, that sounds simple, but that I think is one of the key things that I took away from that, and that it is very important for making characters feel realistic.
No, I don't think it's simple at all. I think it's really well put, and I think one of the lines you had in there is that the player is interrupting them, and I think that one sentence is a statement is an awesome way to put it, because it's so true and well put. And I think I think anyone listening can probably think to themselves, all of the games where you talk to an NPC and it's like they're waiting for you. It's like they're ready, right? They're like ready for the player to come there and talk to them. And it feels very rote and kind of mechanical in a way. And I have a theater background myself as well. And, obviously that's a big part of talking about and analyzing scripts for theater as well. Good plays. Because those are just moments in time, right? There's lives all around them, and so you want to talk holistically about the characters, and so it's the same for games, and it's great that that's something that you've taken with you, because it's so true. And I think Vampire it shows that in Vampire for sure. Like I feel like every time I'm talking to any of the vampires in that game that I'm interrupting them. They're like they could care less about
quite a number
me.
of the humans too. Yeah.
Yeah, right, exactly. I mean, obviously, I was not
comes up to you on the street. Like you have all these. You are sometimes apprehensive depending on where you are, what time of day it is. You would be a little nervous, or you would be kind of why is this person talking to me?
Yeah. Especially all like the leaders of the clans and stuff, because they always are so much more important than me. And whenever I would come up and talk to them, it felt like they had some grand plan that they were working on, and then just like here comes this newbie coming around. Yeah, so yeah, that's cool. That's cool. My selfish question was really coming back to actually Brett's intro. We looked it up, and I don't know if it's probably confirmed out there, but was the cabbie Cain?
I get this question every time, and my answer.
Oh, good. All right, good. I at least I'm predictable.
And my answer is, it's best that I leave it to you to figure that out.
Good answer.
I won't ever confirm, the identity of the cabbie.
Awesome. That's a great answer. That's probably the answer I hoped you would say. So, because it felt like we kind of needed to ask, but it's so funny, and I'm not surprised that everyone asked that question. But great. And as Nosferatu, like I joked about in the intro, I only got to see him really once because I never used the cab. But so it was a mysterious character. But I think that character was also just a fun example of the game in general, of just how memorable they were and how much mystery there was in the game. So. Well, thank you.
Thank you so much, Brian. This has been a delight. I mean, as Tim said, like I've got all these questions about working with the Half-Life 2 engine and like building dialogue systems in a game that doesn't have any, for example. But
yeah, we didn't even get to that.
Aside for another time when we're all able to gather again someday and chat that stuff over.
This is great for me. I don't, it's usually not, I'm not usually talking to other devs. And like I would have like a million questions about working at LucasArts. So,
well, post pandemic, you're local where I'm at, and Brett visits sometimes too. So I'm sure we can get together someday and talk about all that stuff. Have fun.
All right. Thanks so much.
Yeah, thank you.
Hi, gang. Brett here. Thanks for Brian Mitsoda. Thanks to him for joining us a few weeks ago. We recorded this back before Christmas just for timing issues. And Brian himself was moving at the time and would not be available until even after when this is airing. So it made sense to try to get it in the can, but we didn't want to break up our Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time super series. So we thought we'd hold it off and put it at the end of that. Next week, of course, we will do our annual takeaways, which are now bleeding so far into 2021 that really, can it even be called a 2020 takeaway? I don't know. Who even knows what time is anymore in this very, very destructive year? Anyway, we do have some feedback, but we're holding off on this week because I decided to give Tim the week off. From feedback, etc., because he's so tired from hitting men on his streams. I'll talk about that in a moment. But of course, we'd love to have your reviews and feedback at Apple Podcasts or through email at devgameclub@gmail.com. If you use another podcatcher that allows reviews and you don't hear us reading it, go ahead and send us a line. We'd love to read them on the air. And thanks so much for sending them. And, of course, all your feedback. You can find us on the web at devgameclub.com or on Twitter at devgameclub, where you can also find my co-host at... Oh, right, he's not here. At Tim Longo Jr. with, I guess, some sort of JR at the end. You can also find him now streaming Twitch Tuesday nights at 6 to 7-ish Pacific time. At twitch.tv/Tim Longo Jr., same as his Twitter handle. Our intro and outro music was written and performed by Kirk Hamilton and commissioned by friend of the cast Aaron Evers. And our new logo is by Mark Garcia. Thanks so much for joining us this week, and good night.